everyone, and welcome. We appreciate you joining us from all around the country today. This America and the World Flashpoints lecture event is part of a Council by Council Amplified Week, an Ideas Summit presented by the World Affairs Council Network nationwide. This week, councils from all around the U.S. are working together to highlight the power of the World Affairs Council Network. We encourage everyone joining us today to please support their local councils wherever they are at. There is a council, at least one in every state. It's a fabulous way to grow your network, to learn from highly distinguished experts on international topics. World Affairs Councils are non-political, non-partisan, but we don't shy away from thought-provoking issues. Our mission is to bring you the most fact-based information we can and let you ask your own questions. That's really at the heart of what we do. This organization is fueled by individuals and businesses like you who want to know more about foreign policy and current events. And today, we're really fortunate that one such organization, which is the South Carolina chapter of the Fulbright Association, has stepped forward to help support this programming. We are so grateful for that. I'd like to ask a friend of mine who is also president of the South Carolina chapter and a member of our own World Affairs Council Upstate Steering Board, Dr. Alex Akuli, to join us for a moment and tell us a little bit about what South Carolina Fulbright does.
Great, thank you, Tracy. Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the South Carolina Fulbright Alumni Association, thank you for participating in today's lecture. My name is Alex Akuli, and I serve as the Director of Center for International Studies at the University of South Carolina Upstate, and also as the incoming President of the South Carolina Fulbright Association. The Fulbright Association promotes and supports international education and mutual understanding at home and abroad. Fulbright Association extends the international exchange experience of our U.S. alumni into a lifelong experience in service of people-to-people diplomacy. Fulbright alumni are exceptional academics from all areas of study. Through their service abroad, Fulbrighters bring American values to all corners of the world. And in doing so, they also bring home rich perspectives and deeper understanding of their host communities abroad. I am delighted that the moderator for today's lecture, Dr. Courtney Tollison, is also a Fulbright alumni. She served in Ukraine. Thank you for having us today. Enjoy the lecture.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. And thank you, Alex, again for your support and being part of our World Affairs Council Upstate, representing the University of South Carolina. So we have two incredible people on this, our speaker and our moderator. Both of them have so much that they have done that it's going to take me a little bit of time to go through this. So let me start with Michele Gelfand, who's a distinguished university professor at the University of Maryland at College Park. She uses field, experimental, computational, and neuroscience methods to understand the evolution of culture, as well as the multi-level consequences for human groups. Now that's a lot, okay? But her work has been cited over 20,000 times, featured in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, NPR, Voice of America, Fox News, NBC News, ABC News, The Economist, Day Standard, and that's just a few. So if that doesn't impress you, she's also had at least 15 published her work in 15 distinguished scientific outlets on all sorts of issues on psychology related to this. She also received over $13 million in research funding from the National Science Foundation, Department of Defense, and the FBI. So that's, I have to say something. So she is the author of, and this just came out recently in 2018, published by Scribner. It's a book called Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire the World. And that sounds like a great read, and I'm looking forward to finding a copy of that myself. And also, she was recently on NPR on April 6th doing a thing which you actually can find if you're interested to follow up, and we will have it on our site for you to look at. So hopefully you'll get a chance. She's a native New Yorker, but lives in University Park, Maryland with her husband, 2 daughters, and a dog, Pepper. Okay, so now let me introduce our moderator, who also is an outstanding scholar. She is at Furman University, where she is Distinguished University Scholar and Public Historian. She was one of the founding historians for the Upcountry History Museum and the founding director of the Furman University Oral History Project. So she is our local expert on history and specializes in American history and particularly South Carolina history. She's, as you said, we heard from Alex, a Fulbright scholar, having been in Ukraine. And she also is a graduate of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College Military History Instructors Program at Fort Leavenworth. And she's also graduated from the Raleigh Institute Diversity Leadership Initiative. She has published 2 books, curated 3 museum exhibits, worked on several documentaries, conducted over 100 oral histories, and served as a historian for memorials, markers, and sculptures throughout our downtown Greenville. She's active on many boards throughout the state, and you often find her on local TV and in our local newspaper, journals throughout the state also. She's been published and interviewed in the Boston Globe, USA Today, History Channel, and ABC News. So I have to say, we have incredible people here to hear from. And I'm so glad that you come to enjoy your lunch with us and share this great moment. And thank you for coming. And now I'll pass it on to Courtney. Courtney, thank you again for coming.
Thanks for that introduction, Rob. And I'm really excited to be doing this today. And thank you to the World Affairs Council Upstate for asking me to do this. Becoming just a little bit more familiar with Dr. Gelfand's work has really been an enjoyable process for me in the past few days. Her talk today is her presentation, which will last about half an hour, is titled Rebels versus Rule Followers in a Crisis, Who Wins? She is by training a cultural psychologist, but her work is incredibly multidisciplinary and taps into so many different fields. So I'm interested in hearing more from her about how we as a culture, politically and otherwise, pull together, and maybe more specifically with the United States and South Carolina, how we don't pull together. Dr. Gelfand said the other day that she's just accepted a position at the Stanford Business School, so she'll be making the move across the country fairly soon. But that again just attests to how much work she does in the business sector, in the public health sector, and also with the government. So right now I'll turn it over to Dr. Gelfand, who will talk for about half an hour, and then I'll make some comments afterwards, and then we'll take questions from you guys who have joined us today. So as she's speaking, please go ahead and feel free to formulate your questions and type them into the chat feature that's on the Zoom app. And then I'll get the questions and I'll pose them to her after her presentation. All right, we'll go ahead and hand this over to Dr. Gelfand.
Thank you so much, Courtney. And I'm just honored to be here today to speak to your great group. I'm going to start, just kind of get my slides there, with a favorite story of mine about 2 fish. And they're swimming along, and one fish says to another, they're swimming along, and a fish passes by them and says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And they swim on, and they look at each other, and one says to the other, "What the heck is water?" And this story just illustrates a really important point, which is that sometimes the most important realities around us are the ones that are most difficult to see. And for fish, that is water, but for humans, that's culture. And culture is really an interesting puzzle because it's all around us, it's omnipresent, but it tends to be invisible, and we take it for granted. But it's affecting everything from our politics to our parenting, and we need to know more about it. What's interesting is, as humans, we've accomplished many technical feats. We've put a man on the moon, we've wired the earth, and we've even discovered the laws of gravity. But what if we can discover some of the laws of culture, the deeper cultural codes that drive our behavior? If we could, then maybe we could understand each other a little bit better and build a better world. I do want to say that I wasn't always so interested in culture. As you mentioned, I'm a native New Yorker. Sorry, this slide is. And I had this typical New Yorker view over the world for many years. There's basically, this cartoon shows New Yorkers sort of think about the world through a New York-centric perspective. There's New York, there's New Jersey, we acknowledge New Jersey at least, but then there's basically the rest of the world. And this view of the world was shattered when I went to the UK for a semester abroad when I was at Colgate University my junior year. And I remember experiencing a lot of culture shock and being totally dazed and confused. And I called my father from Brooklyn, and I was confiding in him this culture shock, among other things, how puzzling it was that people just went from London to Paris or to Amsterdam just for the weekend. My father said something very important. He said, think about it like it's going from New York to Pennsylvania in his Brooklyn accent. And I thought that was such a powerful metaphor that the very next day, this is a true story, I booked a trip to Egypt. In my reasoning, it was like going from New York to California. My dad wasn't too happy about that, but it's really in Egypt and later in my travels around the world that I recognized how important and powerful culture is in affecting our behavior, but I knew nothing about it. And therefore, I really knew nothing about myself as an American. And I went back to Colgate and I pivoted from being pre-med to going on to getting a PhD in cross-cultural psychology at the University of Illinois with Harry Triandis, who was one of the founders of the field, and the rest was history. So since then, I try to use the tools of science, try to understand how cultures vary around the world and within our own nation. And I started out just analyzing a lot of interesting trends, like why, or in contrast, why in Singapore, which is called the fine country, are people punished for many different things, including spitting or not flushing the toilet in public, or even walking in front of your curtains naked in Singapore could actually get you a fine. If you go over to New Zealand on a short plane ride, you'll see people going barefoot in banks. You'll see thousands of bras strung along fences. You might even witness some couch burnings on campuses. And New Zealand is the only country I know of that had its own national wizard. This is the national wizard, was just retired in New Zealand. And he was an interesting character. He was a fired professor who set up shop in New Zealand streets and lectured on everything from rugby to religion. And instead of punishing the deviant, the prime minister of New Zealand asked him to become the wizard and to entertain the country. And that he did. He used to hatch himself from gigantic eggs on libraries and other shenanigans. You can go around the world and see other contrasts. For example, in Germany, people tend to wait patiently on the street corner, even when there's no cars in sight. Whereas in my own beloved native New York, you see people jaywalking constantly, even with children in tow. This is an interesting device. You see it here on the left. It's actually something being implemented in some German cities, and it's called street pong. And this guy here is playing ping pong with a dude across the street. And it's actually an incentive to stay put and be entertained while you're waiting patiently. In other more serious contrasts, why is it that we can smoke weed openly in the Netherlands, but you can get the death penalty for this in Malaysia? These are just some trends you see around the world, some contrasts. And the question is, what ties these examples together? Is they all reflect differences in social norms, or these unwritten rules for behavior that sometimes become more formalized into laws. And what's astonishing is that humans have this uncanny ability to develop, maintain, and enforce social norms. They're really important in predicting each other's behavior. And in fact, we take them for granted on a daily basis. Imagine a world without social norms, where people drive on either side of the street and ignore traffic lights. Or you go into a nice restaurant in your local South Carolinian context and you see people stealing food off each other's plates and burping loudly and doing all other sorts of norm-violating behavior. Or imagine walking to an elevator and people are facing backwards. Or imagine people have sex anywhere in public parks, on trains. There's a good reason why they don't, because humans have developed social norms. They're the glue that keep us together, and they're very important for our societies to be able to survive. But what I've been focused on in my research is that that glue can be stronger or weaker depending on the context. And this is what I've been referring to as the difference between tight and loose cultures. Tight cultures have strong norms and punishments for deviance, and loose cultures are much more permissive and have weaker norms. And it's this distinction of tight and loose that I want to share with you how it affects our nations and our states, our organizations, what happens when people cross these different cultures, and how can we understand these differences and have more empathy for each other's mindsets. And I'm going to come later on to the topic of this talk, also how this also reflects our responses to crises. And so we'll talk about that toward the end of the talk. So let me just describe to you some of the data that we collected on this construct. The first study that we did was collected across 30+ nations and continents across many languages and people. And this research was published in Science. And this was the first stab that we wanted to see, can we characterize nations in terms of the strength of their norms? And we actually were able to do that. We could see in our data that places like Singapore and Japan and Germany and Austria veered tighter. And countries like New Zealand and Greece and the Netherlands, and to some extent the US, veered looser. And this is a continuum, and all cultures have tight and loose elements, but we might prioritize being stricter or more permissive depending on the context. And what we were interested in understanding is, what are the trade-offs that tight and loose provide or confer to human groups? And why might these differences have evolved in the first place? What factors actually cause the evolution of these differences? And I'm just going to give you a brief picture of the trade-offs that we found with tight and loose cultures, which I'm referring to as a order versus openness trade-off. So tight cultures have a lot more order. In our data, they had less crime and more monitoring. They also tended to be more religious, where we could think about God being also a source of monitoring. We also found that tight cultures had more uniformity in terms of the clothes that people wear, the cars that they drive, and even the clocks in city streets tended to be more synchronized in tight cultures. In Japan and in Switzerland, clocks were off by milliseconds in public streets. But in places like Greece and Brazil, you weren't entirely sure what time it was. And also tight cultures have more self-control. In context where there's more monitoring and punishments for behavior, people tend to self-regulate more. There's less debt and there's less obesity. And there's also less gambling and alcoholism in tight cultures, controlling for a lot of factors. So you could think about tight cultures cornering the market on order, and loose cultures struggling with these things, having higher crime, less uniformity and synchrony, and more self-regulation problems. But loose cultures in our data corner the market on openness. They're more tolerant of different people. In some studies that we did, we sent RAs around the world wearing facial stigmas. I bought them from the internet, and we asked them to ask for help in city streets. And they were also sometimes wearing tattoos and nose rings. And in other cases, they were just wearing their normal face. And what we found was really interesting. People, when they were just asking for directions with their normal face, there was no cultural differences in how much they were helped on city streets. But there's people that had those stigmas that were helped far more in loose cultures and much less in tighter cultures. Loose cultures also have higher creativity, and they tend to be more open to change. But the question is, what causes these differences in the first place? There was no similarity between tight and loose cultures in terms of their GDP or their languages or their religion or traditions. But one thing that we found that differentiated tight and loose cultures was the degree to which they experienced collective threats. And collective threat can be from either Mother Nature, think chronic natural disasters, or famine, or it could be from human threat, think constant invasions on your territory or high population density or pathogens. And the idea is pretty simple. When you have a lot of collective threat, you need stronger rules to coordinate, to survive. Norms provide that coordination mechanism and help people to behave themselves and stay safe during times of crisis. So we found in this data, as we were collecting data among people, we were collecting data on the nation's histories and their ecologies. And we found some robust relationships between tightness scores and things like food deprivation, territorial threat, how many times a nation was potentially invaded over the last 100 years by their neighbors, natural disasters, pathogen prevalence, and population density, even as far back to 1500. So this can kind of help us to understand some puzzling differences around the world. For example, why it is that you're not allowed to bring in a lot of gum into Singapore? A lot of Americans might think that's really puzzling. Why would you not be allowed to chew gum? But it turns out that Singapore has over 20,000 people per square mile, and that's a lot of mouths per capita. And it was causing a lot of problems in Singapore where people were throwing their gum on the ground and it was getting caught in sensors and elevators and trains. And Lee Kuan Yew said to the country, hey guys, we're going to have to ban this tasty treat because it's causing a lot of problems. And if we lived in Singapore, we might understand this new rule if we were in those kinds of circumstances. Now, not all tight cultures are threatened, and not all loose cultures are on easy street, but we can, and there's certainly exceptions to the theory that we can talk about that are really super interesting. That speaks to the fact that we have to analyze any nation in terms of its own local context, but this could give us a sense of why it might be that we see these differences in constraint and latitude. I want to mention that this is not just a modern phenomenon. In partnership with some anthropologists, I've been analyzing ethnographies for also to see whether we can differentiate tight and loose societies that were in the pre-industrial era. And we can code these ethnographies for rules and punishments in a variety of different domains. These are very long and rich descriptions of cultures by anthropologists. And we could see that across these ethnographies, we can code for law and ethics, socialization, gender, marriage, sexuality. And we were able to see that just like in the modern era, the pre-industrial societies also varied on tightness and looseness. This just gives you an idea of where these societies were. And again, we could see the same pattern that there was a connection between collective threats like density, warfare, pathogens, and scarcity that was associated with differences in tight loose. This data is all correlational, so it's important to remember it does not infer causation, but we have been doing a lot of work with computer scientists, in particular evolutionary game theorists, to look at how threat causes the evolution of tight loose, and I could talk more about that offline. But I want to mention this is a lens that we can now use to analyze differences, not just across nations, but even within nations, particularly those that are really diverse, and also in our organizations, and even our own rule-making, rule-breaking mindsets. And I call this a fractal pattern of human difference. That's a metaphor from physics that just refers to a repeating pattern of difference across different levels of analysis that might have some similarity. And I want to just present to you a little bit of data on states and organizations before I get to the question of which is better, tight or loose. And I wish I could actually be there with you in person so you can vote, but we're going to get to that question, and then we'll get to some issues related to Corona. So I'm just going to show you some of the data from our new map of the US, which was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, where we wanted to move beyond red versus blue and see if we can put states on a map from tight to loose as a continuum. And you can see here that the darker shades reflect greater tightness, and the South and some parts of the Midwest tend to be tighter in our data. And what you could see here is the remarkable correspondence between natural disasters in the US and our tight loose map. We analyzed predictors just like at the national level and found that, in fact, tighter states did have higher natural disasters, more pathogen prevalence, and also more food scarcity. We also looked at the consequences in terms of these order and openness trade-offs that I've been talking about. And we could see the same kinds of trade-offs that we see at the national level. State tightness was related to having higher personality conscientiousness, which is another way of thinking about rule orientation. Tight states also had more social organization, more law enforcement, less homelessness, less divorce, and they also had higher indices of self-control, lower recreational drug abuse, and less debt, controlling for factors. Loose states, again, had cornered the market on openness. They had greater personality openness, more creativity, and more equality. In other data that I talk about in the book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, we also could see that tightness is related to politeness at the state level. The tightest states are the more polite states. My own very own beloved New York is the rudest state in the union. So I want to just mention that we can also use this lens to analyze organizational differences. Think about the organization that you work in or you've worked in the past. How does it reflect differences in tightness and looseness? We know from our work in organizational behavior that organizations differ on their people, on their practices, and on their leadership. And we can think about those three different layers in terms of tight and loose. And an interesting question is what happens when organizations with this different cultural DNA wind up merging? And they have to face this big cultural iceberg in terms of differences in norm strength. And I'll talk to you a little bit about the data we have on that. And I want to just mention that tight organizations, like tight societies and states, are more focused on predictability and rules. They're more formal. They have stronger socialization and monitoring. And they have people who are more prevention focused, focused on avoiding mistakes and managing impulses. These are particularly important characteristics in certain industries that actually experience a lot of threat and coordination needs, like manufacturing firms, hospitals, airlines, the police. It makes sense that in this context, we need to be more strict. Loose organizations have very different DNA. They're more focused on flexibility, experimentation. They're more informal and have less monitoring, and they're more promotion focused in terms of risk-taking and openness. They tend to evolve in industries where they make sense to have more of these characteristics, like startup, design, and tech. And these contexts have less safety risks and less coordination needs. Tight and loose organizations also have different people leading them. In some research that we've done, that was done across 62 societies, we asked people for what kind of attributes contribute to being an effective leader. And we found the answer to this question was really different depending on your tight and loose vantage point. In tight cultures, people like autonomous leaders. In loose cultures, people like charismatic and team-oriented leaders. So you can see that the people, the practices, and the leadership in tight and loose cultures varies a lot in terms of tight and loose characteristics. And there's a really important issue about how is your own mindset matching the kind of DNA that's in the organization that you're in. What happens when tight and loose organizational cultures merge? Often it's the case that organizations merge based on strategic types of compatibilities. In the recent, for example, Amazon and Whole Food merger, there were a lot of strategic types of compatibilities, but actually beneath the surface, there was a lot of cultural incompatibility along tight and loose lines. You can think back to the merger of Daimler and Chrysler as a more historical example of another merger that was actually at first seen as a match made in heaven that soon turned out to be a really messy merger that ultimately divorced. But can we take these anecdotal examples and put a price tag on the differences that in terms of tight and loose mergers that happen? And that's exactly what we did. We analyzed 4,700 cross-border acquisitions across countries and across years that was published recently in the Harvard Business Review. And we were looking at differences in tight and loose and how they affected ROA change across time. And we controlled for a lot of different factors in terms of the deal size, the amount of experience that the companies had, and many other things. And what we found was that a big difference in tightness, looseness across these organizations had a really big impact on ROA loss. One standard deviation change, for example, amounted to about a US $245 million losses in net income. And these differences were even more pronounced in high-tech industries compared to manufacturing. And they were even more pronounced when the acquirer was a tight culture. This just gives you a sense that these differences are really important to analyze before we merge with other organizations. In the HBR paper, we talk about the idea that we need to prepare to negotiate culture before we're merging. And that involves, first of all, assessing where are we in an organization on tight-loose? Which aspects of the organization are tighter or looser? Which areas are we willing to negotiate greater or less norm strength? This is what I call tight-loose ambidexterity, being prepared to negotiate the norms as we're actually merging in other cultures. In some contexts, we need to loosen up tight cultures. We need to, even though tight cultures need to have stronger norms for good reasons, maybe there's a way to actually find some domains that are not safety related where we can have more discretion. And this is what I call flexible tightness. On the flip side, some organizations need to tighten up their loose cultures that maybe became too chaotic and too unstructured. And this is what I call structured looseness. And I teach negotiation at the University of Maryland to executives and to students. And I think that in any negotiation, we need to think about what's our highest priority and how can we help the other to get their highest priority. So this is something that we can start thinking about as a dynamic construct that can be negotiated. So I want to ask you now to think about which is better, tight or loose. So I want you to kind of raise your hand if you think tightness is better. I can't see you, but I'll imagine you. And raise your hand if you think looseness is better. And I'll just mention that this is a question that has been subject to an age-old debate across many different disciplines. Another way of putting this is, do we, as societies, do we want to have a lot of freedom or constraint? So if people like Plato and Confucius and Hobbes, the answer to their question was, no, we should have more constraint. But people like John Stuart Mill and even Freud thought that rules make us neurotic, and they argued for more freedom. So the answer is, which is correct? What do the data say? And we had the hunch that maybe neither are correct. Maybe groups need to veer tight or loose for good reasons based on their ecology or their goals. But actually, cultures that veer too tight or too loose may be maladaptive. This is what I've been calling the Goldilocks principle of tight-loose, which I talk about in one chapter in the book. And that just suggests that as you get extreme, if you're too tight, then you have a lot of repression and people want to escape that system. On the other hand, as groups get to be too loose, they get to be too chaotic and they're unpredictable, and there's very little ability to coordinate. And this is what we show in data that was published a few years ago, that nations that are either too tight or too loose have higher depression, higher suicide, higher blood pressure, and both extreme tightness and looseness relate to lower happiness. This principle, the Goldilocks principle, is actually applied not just to societies. It could be seen as applying to organizations. For example, United Airlines needs to veer tight, but some years ago when they had a big PR fiasco, it was argued that they actually became too tight, such that people weren't questioning rules that didn't make sense. They needed to be more flexibly tight. On the flip side, places like Uber or Tesla arguably were becoming too loose, even though they arguably should veer loose, and they needed to have more structure to be able to scale up, what we call structured looseness. And the principle also applies even to our own households. I'm a parent of 2 daughters, and we know from research in developmental psychology that parents that are either too tight and helicopter-like or too loose produce maladaptive kids. So again, we can think about how do we negotiate those norms in our own household? And I can speak to that a little bit later, how in our family, we diagnose different domains of tight-loose and then hit the negotiation table. So this just speaks to the importance of identifying context we might need to tighten loose norms or where we're meant to loosen tight norms. And this brings me to the final part of the talk, which is how can we think about what's happening in our own context right now where we're experiencing this horrible pandemic. And what we theorized in this context is that threat has been linked to the evolution of tightness, and that having stricter rules during time of threat is really important in coordinating. And what we thought about was that the need for coordination to survive these kind of collective threats can be satisfied through 2 mechanisms. One is having stricter norms, following social distancing norms, hand washing. The other is having governments that are very efficient, who can rapidly deploy resources to coordinate the private and public sectors. And I argued in a recent op-ed that these processes of tightening up are going to be harder in looser cultures that are used to having much more permissiveness and are not used to having a lot of collective threat. This was something that I wrote about in the Boston Globe in early March, that we need to tighten up in order to, in the early stages in particular, flatten the curve. So we started to get some data on this. This is data that we have now under review at a journal. And I wanted to show you what this looks like when you factor in tightness and efficiency of governments. And I want to emphasize that this is controlling for a lot of factors like population density. It's controlling for GDP and average age. It's also controlling for authoritarianism, because we're not arguing that efficient governments are autocratic. They're governments that have not been spending more than their means. They're governments that are able to coordinate the public and private sector. So all these results actually are above and beyond any of these factors. And what you see here is that the nations that were able to flatten the curve much better are those on the lower right corner here in the red line. And those are cultures that tend to be tight and have efficient governments, as compared to other combinations of this. I want to emphasize that in later stages of pandemics, we would expect that having looseness is actually very important once we contain the virus, because looseness is related to creativity and technical ingenuity. So again, as we're going forward with dealing with corona, in my view, we'll be dealing with this tight and loose dance where we have to figure out how do we enforce stricter norms when we need to, when things are getting more out of control and we need to start to flatten curves again, and also be creative in that process. So this is just another way of looking at this data. We partnered again with some evolutionary game theorists to show that this is not just based on corona data, but we can see that in the computational models, that you can see the tight line is blue and the loose line is green. And as threat is increasing, which is the x-axis, we see that it's the tighter groups that are able to more quickly coordinate and cooperate under threat. And loose groups eventually catch up, but it takes longer. So I want to thank you today for having me here. And I'm really excited that Courtney is moderating this. I'm now a big fan of Courtney's research also, and I can't wait to connect with you and perhaps work together. All of the work that I mentioned is in the book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers. And I just want to end with one last slide, which has to do with, again, how we come to know ourselves and how we've been socialized in terms of our own backgrounds, our cultures, our family culture, our organizational cultures have all actually cultivated our own tight loose mindsets. And I ask you the question, are you a rule maker or a rule breaker? You could go to my website and you'll see a quiz that I constructed that's based on the science data. And actually, I used Dahlia Litwick's metaphor, fabulous metaphor of the Sesame Street characters and Muppets. Are you an order Muppet or are you a chaos Muppet? And you know, we all have a default on our own for our own selves in terms of where we veer tight or loose, even if we change depending on the situation. But the important thing is that once we realize where we fall on this continuum and where others do, we can start to cultivate some empathy for others' mindsets. These kinds of differences cause a lot of conflict in our marriages, with our kids, with our colleagues. But once we understand maybe why people veer tight or loose, we might be able to not just have empathy, but start to identify and negotiate the kind of conflict that has its source of tightness, looseness. So I want to just end it there, and thank you so much for having me today on your podcast and program.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. And yes, I'd love to discuss ways that we could research together in the future. I am going to now share my screen. Looks like, let's see, we've got a issue where the host has disabled the screen sharing, which if we can work it out, great. But if not, I'll just continue to walk through. So
do I share screen with you? No, that will just get me back to my.
Well, let me see. Let me see if I can do that now. Oh, yep. Here we go. All right. Can everybody see that? Can you see it?
Yep.
Michelle? Yep. Great. Okay. All right. Just anecdotally, before I start my comments, I just would like to say that in regards to Americans and South Carolinians and rules, and from my perspective as a historian, it seems that tight and loose is correlated so much to the historical experience of how those rights that we all have and don't have were and were not developed. And not only that, but one's specific relationship to civil rights, to voting rights, seems also that would be a critical component in our tight and loose approaches, and maybe how flexible and how rigid we are and aren't in regards to adapting to crises like the current one that we're in right now. I think many straight white Americans have historically taken civil liberties for granted because several centuries in, we don't really know what it's like not to have them, unless you identify as part of a minority group, or you've lived in places where people are actively agitating, advocating for their rights. you really don't know anything different. I certainly, my experience, as a Fulbrighter in Ukraine certainly deepened my appreciation of my civil and voting rights and the freedoms that I have as an American in a way that I never could have experienced before. Let me go ahead and get started with just a few comments. The title of Dr. Gelfand's talk made me laugh because for a long time in South Carolina's history, white South Carolinians in particular took great pride in being rebels, which certainly gives us some insight into South Carolina culture. For the sake of brevity, I'm not going to get too much into this. I am going to make some generalizations here today, but I do want to at least acknowledge that South Carolina is not a monolithic entity. We have geographic differences. We have differences in faith. We have differences in barbecue, as you can see here in the middle left map of South Carolina. Swamp, woods, big old mountains. Faith differences, tourist locals, and of course differences in race, class, and gender as well. A little historical perspective on the loose culture in America. As with all cultures, there are historical underpinnings, and I want to draw everyone's attention to a particular speech that was given in the 1890s and research that came out of it by a scholar named Frederick Jackson Turner. And he gave a speech in the early 1890s that we now know as the Frontier Thesis. And in it, he argued that American identity was distinctly shaped by the experience of settling the frontier. And that the frontier, the fact that America had a frontier, had land that was, unexplored and unsettled, was the reason why America and Americans were so different from other much older societies where land had been explored and settled centuries prior. So how were Americans distinctive, according to Turner? The courage, innovation, sense of adventure, and self-reliance that propelled people to leave civilization, which was, the East Coast, and take all their belongings to explore and settle relatively uncharted land, created a culture, and Dr. Gelfand referenced this, of creativity, entrepreneurialism, independence, autonomy, and this was scornful of centralized authority. These types of values have served America very well in many instances, but they don't transition easily into obedient, subdued, rigid conformity. We think of that behavior as the antithesis of the American way. That kind of acquiescence to authority is not American, in quotes. But as Dr. Gelfand said, maybe our American creativity and sense of innovation will serve us better later as we navigate through this pandemic. So let's talk about South Carolina and rules and our historical relationship to these rules. Historically, South Carolinians have been skeptical of outsiders. As we were talking the other day, Kim mentioned that South Carolinians historically do not like to be told what to do by outsiders. We like to make our own rules, and historically we've been suspicious of the federal government. States' rights has been a rallying cry for those who don't agree with federal law since the 1820s. This is what took us into the Civil War, led us through the redemption period after Reconstruction, redemption, of course, in quotes. And certainly it has been used as in opposition to civil rights for African Americans and others and other minority groups. It typically serves as a veil to mask opposition to civil rights and racial uplift for African Americans. Our own rationale is sometimes short-sighted. I should back up and explain that in the decades leading up to the Civil War, that Greenville was a bastion of unionism. Most white Greenvillians, about 86% actually, and that was of course white men who were voting at the time, they opposed secession and war. This was a great contrast to the rest of the state. Greenville had the only unionist newspaper, in the state, and that newspaper suggested that if a state could secede, then a district could too, and then Greenville could actually leave the state of South Carolina to become part of North Carolina. In 1851, two men in Greenville invited a professor at what was then South Carolina College, now it's University of South Carolina, a man named Francis Lieber, who opposed secession and denied its constitutionality, to come and give a 4th of July speech on Main Street in Greenville. And I'm reminded of his comments, Dr. Lieber's comments, as we, at all levels of government, local, state, and federal, weigh this balance of staying healthy with fully re-engaging our society. Lieber's essay rhetorically asked that if we, quote, treat our government as a sort of political picnic to which the invited guest may go and carry his share of the viands, or not, as he thinks fit, or the humor may move him, question mark. Lieber was concerned when individuals spoke of secession as a, quote, remedy, and noted that secession would be as much a remedy as, quote, amputation would be a remedy to cure a troublesome corn, or cutting off one's throat would be a remedy to a migraine, end quote. These South Carolinians traded their desire to maintain slavery for a much larger problem, that of war. Certainly there are some parallels here with COVID-19 and the economy. So despite internal differences, we have historically stuck together against outsiders. And I'm reminded of an instance in the mid-1850s in which a senator from Massachusetts verbally attacked a senator from South Carolina during debates about slave and free states. 2 days later, on the floor of the United States Congress, the South Carolina senator's cousin literally caned the Massachusetts senator until he was unconscious. There was a book published by a gentleman named Ben Robertson in 1941, Red Hills and Cotton, that describes this sentiment of solidarity among South Carolinians. We know why we opposed the Civil War in the Hill Country, but fought it anyhow, because we were Carolinians and Carolina was Carolina. Our relationship with Charleston was like that of our great-great-uncle Billy. We did not speak to Charleston, but would knock down any stranger who spoke of it with a jeer. After all, Charleston is Carolinian, even if its streets are flat. And finally, the South and the nation. The Civil War resulted in decades of deep and contentious sectionalism. You can see in the top right, the map. The gray states were the states of the Confederacy that seceded, and then the different shades of blue, the rest of the nation. The progressive era that followed from the 1890s to the 1920s, one of the goals of the progressive era was national reconciliation in the decades after the Civil War. And the wars that the United States engaged in against foreign enemies, starting with the Spanish-American War and certainly World War I and World War II, had a lot to do with inculcating a sense of pride and nationalism as opposed to regionalism among Southerners, especially white Southerners. World War I training camps, the preponderance of World War I training camps were actually placed in the South. Certainly we had a more mild climate, but this was also a very strategic decision by the federal government to encourage a sense of pride and nationalism, patriotism in the federal government among local civilians. And Dr. Gelfand has also written that in World War II, which was a total war, the United States drew together in solidarity to support a national effort. And it's an example of when the United States evolved from a loose to a tight culture. She says, we know how to do it. We have done it in the past. Also, I'm reminded, who remembers taking friends and family right up to airport gates before 9/11? I'd love to hear Dr. Gelfand's thoughts on this as well. 9/11 introduced an array of new rules that we all must follow for the sake of common security. Yet with the possible exception of the aftermath of 9/11, we've had the, quote, luxuries, Dr. Gelfand says, of not needing to pull together to save ourselves. Dr. Gelfand has also written that in China, efforts aimed at protecting the common good are not only top-down from government officials, but also come from the bottom up, from the people themselves. And so, knowing South Carolina culture historically, I would say we'll definitely help each other out, but we don't want to do so when it's expected or mandated. I do also want to conclude my comments that acknowledging that in South Carolina, more often than not, when women and African Americans and other minority groups have benefited from improved civil voting rights, it's not been the state of South Carolina that has granted them, but rather it's been the federal government that has granted them. So this notion of decentralized authority, local, state, and federal authority, and specifically the relationship between states and federal authority, speaks to this point that different states have handled this pandemic very, very differently. And with that, I think I'd like to engage the question and answer portion of what we're doing here. Let's see, so I'm going to stop sharing. All right.
Thank you, Courtney. That was just fabulous. I mean, I really want to take your classes. I was looking at these great classes that you have, and I'm going to try to negotiate to like be a fly on the wall in your classes, because you just have such an interesting perspective, and I imagine that your classes are just amazing. So,
well, thank you.
I'll be in touch.
And since you are the negotiator coach, you probably be very successful in that. We have a lot of activity, which is wonderful, going on in our chat room here on the app. So I think I'll go ahead and start to select from some of those questions, if that suits you.
Sounds great.
Britt Katz asked, how is tight loose affected, if at all, by current Americans' penchant for constantly moving to different jobs?
Oh, that's such a great question. And, you know, what we can see in some of our research is that mobility relates to looseness. When you're constantly coming and going between different contexts, or in that case, different jobs, then it's harder to agree upon any particular set of rules. And so people become more flexible, have looser mindsets in general. And mobility is also correlated with tight loose at the state level, at the national level also. So countries or states that have a lot of mobility, people coming in and out of the state, again, tend to have higher looseness. So I think that speaks to your question around issues of job mobility, that when we were working for one company for our whole lives, that it was easier to be in a tight mindset in those contexts. And that's something that we see is really changing quite a bit.
Interesting. Another question that we have here is also in regards to tight and loose, and the tight and loose dance in response to COVID-19. The question is, how does the society work if profit seekers determine who lives and who dies? So I guess it's getting at the role of people who stand to benefit. And I'm reminded of this, you know, in the world of wars even. I mean, certainly Americans bound together in World War I and even more in World War II, but there were still people, of course, trying to profiteer from the black market and raising rents and inflation and prices and everything else. So
Yeah.
how do we handle that now?
I think this is a really interesting question. And of course, states are dealing with different aspects of this dance based on their own, you know, how much threat they have from COVID. And so it's understandable that, you know, some states can loosen up earlier than others that have few cases, that don't have a rise in cases, that are flattening the curve. So I think in the US in particular, we need to be mindful of some states that have very few cases. It makes sense to open up. I think the problem we have is exactly, Courtney, what you just mentioned, is when we have states that are really struggling with COVID, And there's people that are still arguing to loosen. And I think that we're going to see some really negative consequences of that in the coming days. And I think we will see shifts back and forth once people start realizing that people, their loved ones, people they know are really succumbing to this horrible virus. And so I think that hopefully we'll be able to negotiate this better as we learn from it. But for now, I think it's important that we keep our local state officials accountable to the facts of what's happening with the pandemic in the local states, to be able to justify realistically opening up and not raising the risk to such high levels that we'll all be affected by that. So
Speaking of politicians, that is a good entree into our next question. Karen Center writes, seems to me that a loose culture would be associated with more of a me-oriented society, one that is very individualistic and arguably selfish, while a tight culture may be more willing to consider the other and to think of society as a whole. In a pandemic, it would seem that the tight culture will band together for the good of everyone and be less worried about their own individual inconvenience. Have you done any research on tight versus loose when it comes to political parties?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of really interesting questions here. And I think that I would just sort of suggest that in response to the first part of your question, that in tighter cultures, it's much easier to sacrifice liberty for rules and constraint, because these cultures have tended to have these kinds of threatening experiences chronically. And we also can see that we're willing to give up freedom for constraint when we suddenly experience a collective threat like 9/11. After the Boston bombing, I was surveying people in Boston, and people who felt very affected by that terrible situation really wanted the US to be tighter. They felt that we're too loose. And of course, after these events are not chronic, we can loosen up again. And Boston, thank God, was not bombed repeatedly. And we didn't have a repeated invasion on our soil. But now we have a situation where the collective threat is, we really have a lot of conflict over politically over whether it's real or not. In 9/11 and Boston bombing, these were real conflicts that drew us instantly together. And now we really need strong leadership to help us cope with this, to help frame this as a collective threat, just like we had in 9/11. And I think that's where a lot of our political divides are evolutionarily upsetting this dynamic, where we would typically really tighten up quickly, like we did in former collective threats. I just want to mention that one other point, what's important, I think, is that you're definitely correct, and your hunch is right, that looser cultures tend to have more of a me orientation, tighter cultures more of a we orientation. But there's also interesting off diagonals of this. There's countries like Germany that tend to be pretty individualistic, but that are tight, that really have a lot of priority on privacy and not so much on family, but really like strong rules. And there's also cultures that are pretty collectivistic, like really we focus, but that are more loose. And this is including places like Greece or Brazil. So there's kind of you can think about it as a 2x2 in terms of individualism and collectivism and tight loose. And I talk a lot about that in the book. But your hunch is right, that in general, we can see that it's harder for people in loose cultures to sacrifice that freedom for constraint.
It's interesting that you brought up Germany with their incredibly interesting and destructive political culture of the early 20th century. I saw that just yesterday, a study by an economist at the Federal Reserve in New York State released findings that correlated spending in a response to, or lack of response to, the 1918 Spanish influenza pandemic with voting patterns that supported Nazism in 1932 and 1933. Mm-hmm. Have you done any research on links between crises like these and that require, very concerted, coordinated government responses and extreme politics?
Yeah, that's something that we published recently, a paper looking at how collective threat affects voting patterns and the direction exactly of what you're describing. We know that tighter cultures prefer autonomous, independent leaders, which makes a lot of sense because they can quickly make decisions in context where there is a lot of threat. But what's interesting about election dynamics now is that threat is not always real. It can be just perceived. And in our research, we could see that when we asked people in the US and in France about their perceptions of threat, that people who feel threatened really feel that the societies are too loose, and that's in turn affecting their voting behavior for, in this case, for Trump, for Le Pen. And as I mentioned, you know, threat could be real, it could be perceived. We definitely have a lot of real threat, clearly now. And in previous elections, you know, there are certain groups that are struggling tremendously in this country based on actual threat that feel that a strong leader, autonomous leader would be useful in those circumstances. It's also the case that leaders understand this psychology. You know, they amplify threats in some cases and target groups that are already feeling threatened in order to gain popularity. Something that we've been creating in our lab is a new threat dictionary, a linguistic dictionary that you could use to analyze online when people are feeling threatened and how that's affecting these kinds of dynamics of who they're attracted to, what they think, you know, which leaders are more acceptable to them and so forth. And so we can analyze that more real time than just the surveys that we've done with dictionaries.
Yeah, that the use of fear, I guess, would be, yeah.
Exactly.
It's a lot out there on politicians and the use of fear and overstating or understating threats, I guess. Here's another question. And this question reminds me of the map that you showed in your presentation. And South Carolina was not quite as loose on the shade of red and pink on that scale as I would have anticipated. And then I realized that we regularly are required, especially people on the coast, to follow state instructions, government instructions because of hurricanes. So the question here, as countries experience more natural disasters from global warming, would you expect more countries to shift from loose to tight? What would be a timeline of such a shift? 9/11 had immediate cultural change, but global warming would be much slower.
Yeah, this is a really interesting point. And I think that we do see that, you know, when countries are threatened collectively, immediately we see, you know, increases in tightening. When threat decreases, we see kind of an asymmetry, that it takes longer for groups to loosen than it does to take them to tighten. We see that with actual empirical data, we see that with the computational models. But also what you could see, to the last part of that question also, is that, you know, as threat is increasing gradually, the data show that loose groups have a harder time catching up with that threat. That we have more of this kind of conflict over norm abidance, over is this really serious? And tighter groups start shifting much earlier in response to gradual threat. So I think it's going to be really important, you know, going forward to be really negotiating the realities around collective threat. We have a lot of conflict over things like climate change. We've had a lot of, you know, distrust of science around the issues. I think we have a lot of negotiating to do on these issues and a lot of work to do in our country to start trusting scientists again and really how serious are these threats. I think Corona is giving us a wake-up call that, you know, Mother Nature is really pretty powerful and that we need to be prepared for collective threat. And I think we can do it like we talked about. I mean, we have had a lot of examples in our historical DNA where we do that, where we come together. And I hope that I'm an optimist. I hope that that's the case, and that as we're learning and struggling through Corona, that it will have important national lessons for us.
There are a lot of questions that are touching on the notion of this transition. And, you know, without scaring the daylights out of everyone, how do we transition from loose to tight? I mean, I actually posed this, I wrote this question down before your presentation, and my follow-up question had to do with, you know, is there a specific leadership style that is credited with transitioning people from one to the other? And I found it really interesting that you mentioned leadership styles in your presentation, and also incorporated the importance of empathy in this transition and in this negotiation. So yeah, if you could talk a little bit more about what leadership style might be effective now in transitioning us in this situation from loose to tighter.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one important thing to keep in mind is that it's temporary. You know, I think one thing that really makes people nervous is like, wait, we're going to become, you know, tighten forever. And I think what we can see in some of our data is that the groups that do tighten are able to flatten the curve better. They're able to, you know, contain the threat. So there's just a kind of a mutual reciprocity between tightening up in response to threat and that norm abidance helping to reduce the threat. So there's a real sense of like, this will help, like, and it's temporary. I think the question of how leaders can help frame this for groups that are resistant to tightening is a really critical question. I think we need consistency and we need scientific evidence that following norms really helps. And we need to cultivate trust in those experts. And I also think that the kind of interventions, what economists call nudges, need to be different for different groups. For looser groups, we have a lot of reactance to rules. Like you mentioned, I thought it was really incredibly interesting. You mentioned, you know, that South Carolinians they're rule followers, but they don't want to be told what rules to follow. And I find that to be incredibly fascinating. And that just suggests that we need to frame nudges as not like, this is what you should do right now. We need to incorporate the psychology of reactance, where people are like, yeah, that might sound right, but don't tell me what to do. We call these kind of soft nudges. One of my students who's at Emory now as a postdoc has been studying how do you frame norms around, you know, helping people to feel freedom, that they're not being threatened. And I think when we say that, you know, this is going to be helpful, this is going to save lives, this is going to save your family, this is going to work, instead of just directly saying, do this. And I think there's other countries that have the same kind of perspective. I was talking to a reporter in the Netherlands, and they struggle with the same thing. You know, people don't want to be told what to do, but they're trying to have a softer approach to norm compliance. And I think there's, you know, a lot of research that's going on now in the behavioral and social sciences, trying to really figure out which, in a kind of a norm tournament, which descriptions help people to follow norms in different contexts, because it won't be a one size fits all. You know, I think many of us, I'll just mention that, you know, this is something that we are dealing with, not just in our own lives, but with our kids. You know, I have two teenagers, and, you know, trying to help them understand that this is temporary, this is painful, this is difficult, but one day, you know, life will go back to normal. So let's, you know, think about this as it's adaptive right now. And I think we finally, you know, I mean, they're pretty amazing and adaptable, but it's tough. And as parents, we're trying to explain and negotiate with kids in the same respect.
So it sounds like, in terms of leadership, consistency, very clear communication, and also knowing your audience and knowing what will resonate effectively with your audience are critical.
Yeah, and I think also in a lot of just in general attitude change work, we need like really strong local leaders who are really modeling that this behavior matters, who are wearing masks, who are, you know, describing why it's so important to be distancing temporarily. That those local leaders, and particularly in tight cultures, they're very sensitive to the messages of who's telling them what to do. So in our data that I presented you on Corona, you know, tight countries don't always do well. If they have inefficient governments, they do really, really poorly because they're following the wrong norm. So you can think about this as almost like two equilibrium. Tight cultures are conformist, so they're listening very strongly to their leaders. And the leaders that are telling them, you know, to be safe helps them to actually adapt much more quickly. Whereas tight groups that are not following groups that are telling them the opposite are actually also doing really poorly, because again, it's following the norm, but the content of that norm really matters. We see that at the national level. And I would imagine it's also the case in the US.
We've talked a lot about geography and people grouped collectively by, you know, borders, essentially national borders. But I'm wondering, you know, to what extent your research has also incorporated race and gender and class, and how it incorporates an understanding that people have historical and culturally different relationships to power.
Yeah, this is a really interesting point. And, you know, in our theory, what we would suggest is that groups that have lower power are living in tighter worlds. So they're held to like higher standards for rules. And we've shown that in one study we published that was modeled after inspired by the Betty Dukes case. In this case, the Walmart class action suit, women and minorities were saying, look, we're punished for deviant behavior much more strictly. If we show up to work late, if we tamper with equipment or take long breaks, like we're punished more strictly, and it affects our promotions and affects our salary. And we did some research to test that idea. And we asked people in organizations, we hypothetically said, you know, people are doing deviant behavior. One person's name is Josh, one is Jamal, one is Letitia, one is Lauren. And we can see that women and minorities were actually, their deviant behavior was perceived more severely and was seen to be more worthy of punishment. So I think that's a general lens that I would say. Also, social class is really super important because a lot of times people see class differences as issues of your pocketbook, but actually in our data, the working class that are trying to avoid the chaos of poverty actually are a lot tighter. The poor and inner cities tend to be very loose and chaotic, you know, and that's because it's really difficult in those circumstances to develop and enforce rules. But the working class is trying to avoid that. And so in our data, they're actually tighter. They're trying to avoid falling into those kinds of collective threats. Actually, one study we did with Jessie Harrington, a student of mine, we asked 3-year-olds to come into the laboratory. These are youngest samples in our data. And you can't exactly ask 3-year-olds about what they think of rules, but we had them playing with a puppet, Max the puppet. And Max was playing these games with the kids from the working class and the upper class. And then all of a sudden in the middle of the experiment, Max started violating the rules of the game and like saying, I'm playing by the rules. And we simply videotaped the kids to see how do they react to this Max, the rule violator now, the puppet. And it was the working class kids that were more upset. They said, stop. They were protesting against the puppet. And it was the upper class kids who, you know, really found it more funny, found it, you know, Max was playful and having a good time. And that's as early as 3 years old. So you can imagine that as we get enculturated in our families, in our societies, in our communities, that these differences become, you know, pretty pronounced. And not all women, not all minorities, not all people from different classes, you know, are necessarily following according to this pattern. There's always variation, but it helps us to kind of take the lens of tight loose and understand why groups might vary on how much they're abiding by or expected to abide by social norms.
That's so interesting. Yeah, it really speaks to if we have these responses at age 3, how much more embedded they are, you know, later in life. One question asks, why is it the loose culture states like New York and California were much tighter in their following of government recommendations to quarantine? And someone, one of our viewers has suggested that maybe it's because they were the leaders and not the followers in the pandemic.
The citizens, you mean, in the states?
That the states,
yeah,
of New York and California.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, in this case, like we said, all groups eventually evolve to be tight in our data when there's a collective threat. In this case, I think there was a very strong threat immediately, to your point of like other states are not quite sure, is this real, is it not? It was really real in these contexts and very scary. And so we could see that they reacted much more quickly and had also the support of leaders eventually also in the context. So, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that there's always variation. And in this case, these places really shouldered a lot of the collective threat. I have relatives there, and you know, it was extraordinarily devastating to see what was going on. So people quickly adapted to the tight norms in order to help flatten the curve, knowing that, seeing it happening to people around you. Like, I think many of us, you know, we know a few people, maybe we know some people, but in these contexts, the kind of 7 degrees of separation was much much more quick to occur in terms of knowing, like, oh my gosh, we've heard of people who have this, and then it becomes much more salient, the threat, and you can see why people would be more willing to engage in a lot of those norms that we're helping to deal with the threat.
Definitely. I'm scrolling through our questions here before I wrap up to see if there are any others. Some of the questions are really about interpersonal relations. I mean, you mentioned that we can throw working class women into one category and you know, middle class African Americans in another, but there's always variation. And you also mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that you guys are negotiating this as a family and just life negotiating with teenagers. And so some of these questions really get at a common theme of rule followers and rule breakers coexisting and just getting along during this situation.
Yeah, I think that, you know, I mentioned I studied negotiation, I teach on negotiation, and we know in negotiation research that, you know, you can't get everything you want. You need to prioritize, you know, what's the most important domain for you, and try to figure out what's that other person's priority. And we've been doing that in our own household with tight loose. My husband, who's an attorney, veers tighter than me, and I veer looser than him. But, you know, we can sort of think about what domains in the household need to be tight. Can we agree on that? I mean, it sounds a little bit hokey to think about, you know, my poor kids, they had to learn about this, you know, be bombarded by tight, loose terminology all the time. But once we can negotiate our priorities, I think it helps a lot. So in our household, we just said, look, you know, how hard they work in school, how they treat each other, and their health, or they have to be tighter. But things like other ways that we can loosen up are, okay, you know, can be a little bit messy. I'll just close the door. You know, I'm not going to try to tighten up every domain. We know that's not healthy. Your bedtime, that's on you. You know, you're going to be accountable on being able to get up and get your work done. Not everyone would solve these negotiations the same way. But for example, we're now doing work with the Navy where we're developing scales. The Navy needs to veer tight for sure, but you know, they're also wondering, how can we be more flexible in certain domains? How can we be flexibly tight? And so we have now a new measure where we're going to be deploying that in organizations, where we could see what are all the domains in organizations that you have to develop rules around: your dress, your language, where you work, how you work. And can we sort of negotiate it in those contexts too? It might be different depending on the organization, but I think the hope is once we have the terminology, we can then make these kind of more local solutions, negotiate these local solutions that make sense. It's invisible. So I think, you know, we often, when we're having conflict over finances or over even loading the dishwasher, I get a lot of feedback on my bad dishwasher behavior. You know, we make sort of dispositional attributions to the person. Oh, they're just being cranky, or oh, they're being annoying. But actually, in many ways, a lot of these things relate to differences in preferences on rulemaking, rule breaking. And if we can understand it, where it comes from, and then negotiate it, I think it can make for better relationships.
This has certainly provided some helpful language to be able to negotiate those. I'm definitely the tighter in my relationship with my husband. He's definitely looser.
Yeah, I think that I'm going to have the sort of dishwashing tight loose test, the next mindset. And the next test will be like, here's a dishwasher, how do you load it? You know? Because I really think it's indicative. Even handwriting, I think, like I get a lot of feedback on, you know, like my daughter, you know, I write her a note when she's late to school and they're like, did you forge this note? Like, and she's like, no, my mom just has really bad handwriting. You know, graphology might be another, you know, kind of subtle hint on where people veer on tight and loose. And again, we all, you know, we can really be fluid in our tight loose mindsets. Like when we are at the library or at a, you know, a funeral, like we tighten up, you know, we're looser depending on the situation, and that makes sense. But we nevertheless have this kind of default that we have cultivated based on our own previous experience, our own personal experiences. And I think it helps to be able to talk about it, especially parenting. You know, you get married, you know, you're excited to be with this person the rest of your life, but you have no idea how tight and loose is going to really affect parenting styles. And so forth. So I think now I'm really doing much more work on that context, bringing it from the national level down to, you know, parenting, even using the same terminology.
You're really talking to me here because my husband and I have a 19-month-old.
Oh boy, so you got a little bit of time, you know.
We might
But,
we might be part of your study, your next study.
you got it. We'll exchange that. I'll be part of your class and you'll be part of the study.
Hey, see, I told you you're a good negotiator. Well, I think that's a great note to end on, and I believe that someone from Upstate International wants to do an announcement about some of the next programs. I also want to say thank you so much, Dr. Gelfand. This has been really eye-opening and helpful and very thought-provoking as we
Thank you.
navigate.
Thanks so much for being a fabulous moderator. It's really one of the best programs on.
All right,
that
you, Rob.
Thank you again. I loved it. It was fantastic. Thank you, Courtney, Michelle. That was amazing. I think we could have gone on for quite a while longer. And again, thank you, Alex Aculli at Fulbright, for doing this sponsorship of this, because I think we all learned something. And I want to also say thanks everybody for joining us, and all the World Affairs Council members from across the country who have joined us for this thing. And we have another one coming up, so I want you to put it on your calendar. May 13th at noon, we do one that's going to be kind of almost a follow-up on it. Sahar Bardi is an Israeli activist and program manager for the American Friends Service Committee. Israeli will be coming to us from Israel, and Dr. Catherine Barberi, associate professor and vice chair of the Department of Political Science from the University of South Carolina. Both of them will be on, and the discussion is going to be on how the restrictions that we have been implemented globally, how has that affected people's rights, civil liberties, human rights? How have governments around the world taken advantage of that, perhaps to close out some of the civil rights of people? So if you're interested in this, which I think will be fascinating, you can go to our website at the World Affairs Council Upstate and register, and please join us, because this is what it's about, this kind of learning. Thank you again for your attention, and let's see you next week.
Thank you.